All right, no one's here. It doesn't matter. I have a copy. All right, this is from Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. We're going to start out with a very long chapter heading. Why, though in the early days of interlaces, interneted teleputers that operated off largely the same fiber digital grid as the phone companies, the advent of video telephoning, aka video phony, enjoyed an interval of huge consumer popularity. Callers thrilled at the idea of phone interfacing both orally and facially. The little first-generation phone video cameras being much too crude and narrow-apertured for anything much more than facial close-ups on first-generation teleputers that at the time were little more than high-tech TV sets. Though, of course, they had that little intelligent agent homuncular icon that would appear at the lower right of a broadcast/cable program and tell you the time and temperature outside, or remind you to take your blood pressure medication, or alert you to a particularly compelling entertainment option now coming up on channel like 491 or something. Or, of course, now alerting you to an incoming video phone call, and then tap dancing with a little iconic straw boater and cane just under a menu of possible options for response. And callers did love their little homuncular icons. But why, within like 16 months or 5 sales quarters, the tumulescent demand curve for video phony suddenly collapsed like a kicked tent, so that by the year of the depend adult undergarments, fewer than 10% of all private telephone communications utilized any video image fiber data transfers or coincident products and services, the average U.S. phone user's deciding that he actually preferred the retrograde, old low-tech Bell-era voice-only telephonic interface after all, a preferential about-face that cost a good many precipient video telephony-related entrepreneurs their shirts, plus destabilizing those 2 highly respected mutual funds that had ground-floored heavily in video phone technology, and nearly wiping out the Maryland State Employees Retirement System's Freddie Mac Fund, a fund whose administrator's mistress's brother had been an almost manically precipient video phone technology entrepreneur. So why the abrupt consumer retreat back to good old voice-only telephoning? The answer, in a kind of triviant nutshell, is emotional stress, physical vanity, a certain queer kind of self-obliterating logic in the microeconomics of consumer high-tech. It turned out that there was something terribly stressful about visual telephone interfaces that hadn't been stressful at all about voice-only interfaces. Videophone consumers seemed to suddenly realize that they'd been subject to an insidious but wholly marvelous delusion about conventional voice-only telephony. They'd never noticed it before, the delusion. It's like it was so emotionally complex that it could be countenanced only in the context of its loss. Good old traditional audio-only phone conversations allowed you to presume that the person on the other end was paying complete attention to you, while also permitting you not to have to pay anything even close to complete attention to her. A traditional oral-only conversation, utilizing a handheld phone whose earpiece contained only 6 little pinholes, but whose mouthpiece, rather significantly it later seemed, contained 6 squared, or 36 little pinholes, let you enter a kind of highway hypnotic semi-attentive fugue. While conversing, you could look around the room, doodle, fine groom, peel tiny bits of dead skin away from your cuticles, compose phone pad haiku, stir things on the stove. You could even carry on a whole separate additional sign language and exaggerated facial expression type of conversation with people right there in the room with you, all while seeming to be there attending closely to the voice on the phone. And yet, this was the retrospectively marvelous part. Even as you were dividing your attention between the phone call and all sorts of other idle little fugue-like activities, you were somehow never haunted by the suspicion that the person on the other end's attention might be similarly divided. During a traditional call, e.g., as you say, let's perform a close tactile blemish scan of your chin, you were in no way oppressed by the thought that your phone mate was perhaps also devoting a good percentage of her attention to a close tactile blemish scan. It was an illusion, and the illusion was oral and orally supported. The phone line's other end's voice was dense, tightly compressed, and vectored right into your ear, enabling you to imagine that the voice owner's attention was similarly compressed and focused, even though your own attention was not, was the thing. This bilateral illusion of unilateral attention was almost infinitely gratifying from an emotional standpoint. You got to believe that you were receiving somebody's complete attention without having to return it. Regarded with the objectivity of hindsight, the illusion appears irrational, almost literally fantastic. It would be like being able to both lie and trust other people at the same time. Video telephony rendered the fantasy insupportable. Callers now found that they had to compose the same sort of earnest, slightly over-intense listener's expression they had to compose for in-person exchanges. Those callers who, out of unconscious habit, succumbed to fugue-like doodling or pants crease adjustment, now came off looking rude, absent-minded, or childishly self-absorbed. Callers who even more unconsciously blemish-scanned or nostril-explored looked up to find horrified expressions on the video faces on the other end, all of which resulted in videophonic stress. Even worse, of course, was the traumatic expulsion from Eden feeling of looking up from tracing your thumb's outline on the reminder pad or just adjusting the old unit's angle of repose in your shorts and actually seeing your videophonic interface idly strip a shoelace of its gumlet as she talked to you, and suddenly realizing that the whole infantile fantasy of commanding your partner's attention while you yourself got to fugue doodle and make little genital adjustments was deluded and insupportable now that you were actually commanding not one bit more attention than you were paying. Here, the whole attention business was monstrously stressful, video callers found. And the videophonic stress was even worse if you were at all vain, i.e. if you were worried at all about how you looked, as in to other people, which, all kidding aside, who doesn't? Good old oral telephone calls could be fielded without makeup, toupee, surgical prosthesis, etc., even without clothes if that sort of thing rattled your saber. But for the image conscious, there was, of course, no such answer as you are informality about visual video telephone calls, which consumers began to see. Just call back. Which consumers began to see were less like having the good old phone ring than having the doorbell ring and having to throw on clothes and attach prosthesis and do hair checks in the foyer mirror before answering the door. But the real coffin nail for videophony involved the way callers' faces looked on their own TP screen during calls. Not their callers' faces, but their own, when they saw them on video. It was a 3-button affair, after all, to use the TP's cartridge card video record option to record both pulses in a 2-way video call and play the callback and see how your face had actually looked to the other person during the call. This sort of appearance check was no more resistible than a mirror, but the experience proved almost universally horrifying. People were horrified at how their own faces appeared on a TP screen. It wasn't just Anchorman's bloat, that well-known impression of extra weight that video inflicts on the face. It was worse. Even with the high-end TP's high-def viewer screens, consumers perceived something essentially blurred and moist-looking about their phone faces, a shiny, pallid indefiniteness that struck them as not just unflattering, but somehow evasive, furtive, untrustworthy, un-us-likable. In an early and ominous interlaced GTE focus group survey that was all but ignored in a storm of entrepreneurial sci-fi tech enthusiasm, almost 60% of respondents who received visual access to their own faces during videophonic calls specifically used the terms untrustworthy, unlikable, or hard to like in describing their own visage's appearance, with a phenomenally ominous 71% of senior citizen respondents specifically comparing their video faces to that of Richard Nixon during the Nixon-Kennedy debates of BS 1960. The proposed solution to what the telecommunications industry's psychological consultants termed video physiognomic dysphoria was, of course, the advent of high-definition masking. And in fact, it was those entrepreneurs who gravitated towards the production of high-definition videophonic imaging and then outright masks who got in and out of the short-lived videophonic area with their shirts, plus solid additional nets. Mask-wise, the initial option of high-definition photographic imaging, i.e. taking the most flattering elements of a variety of flattering multi-angle photos of a given phone consumer, and thanks to existing image configuration equipment already pioneered by the cosmetics and law enforcement industries, combining them into a wildly attractive high-def broadcastable composite of a face wearing an earnest, slightly over-intense expression of complete attention, was quickly supplanted by the much more inexpensive and bite-economical version of using the exact same cosmetic and FBI software, actually casting the enhanced facial image in a form-fitting polybutylene resin mask. And consumers found that the high upfront cost of a permanent wearable mask was more than worth it, considering the stress and VPD reduction benefits, and the convenient Velcro straps on the back of the masks and collar's head cost peanuts. And for a couple of physical quarters, phone cable companies were able to rally VPD-afflicted consumers' confidence by working out a horizontally integrated deal where free composite and masking services came with a video phone hookup. The high-def mask, when not in use, simply hung on a small hook by the sides of a TP's phone console, admittedly looking maybe a bit surreal and discomforting when detached and hanging there empty and wrinkled, and sometimes there were potentially awkward mistaken identity snafus involving multi-user family or company phones, and the hurried selection and attachment of the wrong mask taken from some long empty row of empty hanging masks. But all in all, the mask seemed initially like a viable industry response to the vanity, stress, and Nixonian facial image problem. But combine the natural entrepreneurial instinct to satisfy all sufficiently high consumer demand on the one hand, and what appears to be an almost equally natural distortion in the way persons tend to see themselves, and it becomes possible to account historically for the speed with which the whole high-def videophonic mask thing spiraled totally out of control. Not only is it weirdly hard to evaluate what you yourself look like, whether you're good-looking or not, e.g., try looking in the mirror and determining where you stand in the attractiveness hierarchy with anything like the objective ease you can determine whether just about anything else about you is good-looking or not. But it turned out that the consumer's instinctively skewed self-perspection plus vanity-related stress meant that they began preferring and then outright demanding video phone masks that were really quite a lot better looking than they themselves were in person. High-def mask entrepreneurs ready and willing to supply not just verisimilitude, but aesthetic enhancement. Stronger chins, smaller eye bags, airbrushed scars, and wrinkles soon pushed the original mimetic mask entrepreneurs right out of the market. In a gradually unsubstantializing progression, within a couple more sales quarters, most consumers were now using masks so undeniably better looking on video phones than their real faces were in person, transmitting to one another such horrendously skewed and enhanced masked images of themselves that enormous psychosocial stress began to result. Large number of phone users suddenly reluctant to leave home and interface personally with people who they feared were now habituated to seeing their far better looking masked selves on the phone and would, on seeing them in person, suffer. So went the caller's phobia, the same illusion-shattering aesthetic disappointment that, e.g., certain women who always wear makeup give people the first time they ever see them without makeup. The social anxieties surrounding the phenomenon psychoconsultants termed optimistically misrepresentational masking, or OMM, intensified steadily as the tiny, crude first-generation video phone camera's technology improved to where the aperture wasn't as narrow, and now the higher-end tiny cameras could countenance and transmit more or less full-body images. Certain psychologically and unscrupulously entrepreneurs began marketing full-body polybutylene and urethane 2D cutouts, sort of like the headless muscle man and bathing beauty cutouts you would stand behind and position your chin on the cardboard neck stump for those cheap photos at the beach. Only these full-body video phone masks were vastly more high-tech and convincing looking. Once you added variable 2D wardrobe, hair and eye color options, various aesthetic enlargements and reductions, etc., cost started to press the envelope of mass market affordability, even though there was at the time horrific social pressure to be able to afford the very best possible masked 2D body image to keep from feeling comparatively hideous looking on the phone. How long, then, could one expect it to have been before the relentless entrepreneurial drive towards an even better mousetrap conceived of the transmittable tableau, aka TT, which in respect was probably the really sharp business end of the videophonic coffin nail. With TTs, facial and bodily masking could now be dispensed with altogether and replaced with the video-transmitted image of what was essentially a heavily doctored still photograph, one of an incredibly fit and attractive, well-turned-out human being, someone who actually resembled you, the caller, only in such limited respects as like race and limb number. The photo's face focused attentively in the direction of the videophonic camera from amid the sumptuous but not ostentatious appointments of the sort of room that best reflected the image of yourself you wanted to transmit, etc. The tableau were simply high-quality, transmission-ready photographs scaled down to diorama-like proportions and fitted with a plastic holder over the videophone camera, not unlike a lens cap. Extremely good-looking but not terrifically successful entertainment celebrities, the same sort in who decades past would have swelled the cast lists of infomercials, found themselves in demand as models for various high-end videophone tableaux. Because they simply involved simple transmission-ready photography instead of 149 computer imaging and enhancement, the tableau could be mass-produced and commensurately priced, and for a brief time, they helped ease the transition between the high cost of enhanced body masking and the monstrous aesthetic pressures videophony exerted on callers, not to mention also providing employment for set designers, photographers, airbrushers, and infomercial-level celebrities hard-pressed by the declining fortunes of broadcast television advertising. But there's some sort of revealing lesson here in the beyond short-term viability curve of advances in consumer technology. The career of videophony confirms neatly to this curve's classically annular shape. First, there's some sort of terrific sci-fi-like advance in consumer tech, like from oral to video phone calling, which advance always, however, has certain unforeseen disadvantages for the consumer. And then, but the market niches created by those disadvantages, like people's stressfully vain repulsion at their own videophonic appearance, are ingeniously filled via sheer entrepreneurial verve. And yet, the very advantages of these ingenious disadvantage compensations seem all too often to undercut the original high-tech advance, resulting in consumer recidivism and curve closure and massive shirt loss for participant investors. In the present case, the stress and vanity compensation's own evolutions saw video callers rejecting first their own faces and then even their own heavily masked and enhanced physical likenesses, and finally covering up the video cameras altogether and transmitting attractively stylized static tableaus to one another, TPs. And behind these lens cap dioramas and transmitted tableau, callers, of course, found that they were once again stresslessly invisible, unvainly makeup and toupee-less, and baggy-eyed behind their celebrity dioramas, once again free, since once again unseen, to doodle, blemish scan, manicure, crease check, while on their screen the attractive, intensely attentive face of the well-appointed celebrity of the other end's tableaus reassured them that they were the objects of a concentrated attention they themselves didn't have to exert. And of course, but these advantages were nothing other than the once lost and now appreciated advantages of good old Bell-era blind oral-only telephoning, with its 6 and 6 squared pinholes. The only difference was that now these expensive, silly, unreal, stylized tableaux were now being transmitted between the TPs on high-priced video fiber lines. How much time, after this realization sank in and spread among consumers, mostly via phone, interestingly, would any microeconomist expect to need to pass before high-tech visual telephony was mostly abandoned them, and a return to good old telephoning, not only dictated by common consumer sense, but actually after a while culturally approved as a kind of chic integrity, not Ludditism, but a kind of retrograde transcendence of sci-fi-ish high-tech for its own sake, a transcendence of the vanity and the slavery to high-tech fashion that people view as so unattractive in one another. In other words, a return to oral-only telephony became, at the closed curve's end, a kind of status symbol of anti-vanity, such that only callers utterly lacking in self-awareness continued to use the videophony and the tableau, to say nothing of masks, and these tacky, facsimile-using people became ironic cultural symbols of tacky vain slavery to corporate PR and high-tech novelty, became the subsidized era's tacky equivalent of people with leisure suits, black velvet paintings, sweater vests for their poodles, electric zirconium jewelry, no-coat lingua scrapers, and see. Most common communications consumers put their tableau dioramas at the back of a knick-knack shelf and covered their cameras with standard black lens cap, and now use their phone consoles' little masked hoods to hang these new little plasticine address and phone diaries specifically made with a little receptacle at the top of the binding for convenient hanging from former mask hooks. Even then, of course, the bulk of U.S. consumers remained verifiably reluctant to leave home and teleputer and to interface personally, though this phenomenon's endurance can't be attributed to the videophony fad per se, and anyway, the new pangoraphobia served to open huge new entrepreneurial teleputered markets for home shopping and delivery, and didn't cause much industry concern.